A new trade battle is erupting between the United States and the European Union, with price shocks hitting global markets every time the US dollar shifts. The US has rolled out a blanket 10% tariff on all imports. In response, the European Union has hit back with a 20% duty on American goods, stating clearly, "We'll recover every dollar lost." Over $580 billion in EU exports and $320 billion in US exports, from aircraft to alcohol, from BMWs to soybeans, are now caught in the middle of a growing economic standoff. In this video, we'll break down exactly who will end up paying for these tariffs on both sides of the Atlantic. We'll explain how currency advantages could be wiped out, how interest rate strategies by the Fed and the ECB might get turned upside down, and what form Europe's retaliation could take next. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and like this video so you don't miss our updates. By late summer 2025, Brussels fired back at Washington's blanket tariff plan with a sharp message. If you build a wall, we'll build one too. In a matter of weeks, what was once a diplomatic trade table has turned into a battlefield of nerves and numbers. This isn't new. The transatlantic tariff tension first escalated back in 2018 during the steel and aluminum wars. For 5 years, both sides pushed through court challenges, negotiation tables, and exemption lists. But now, with Donald Trump back in the spotlight and pushing for his universal tariff plan ahead of a second term, the landscape has shifted dramatically. The White House's new plan is simple, strict, and uncompromising. A universal 10% import tariff on all foreign goods, 30-45% on Chinese products depending on the industry, and a 12% import cap on neighboring countries not part of NAFTA. The EU Commission's immediate reaction was to stand by the principle of fair play. A memo sent to the General Affairs Council made it clear, if Washington doesn't back down, Europe will match the blow. That means key U.S. exports will face a 20% surcharge, leading to a transatlantic tariff war within the 10 to 20% range. So, what does that look like in numbers? EU exports to the U.S. are expected to reach $580 billion by the end of 2024. A 20% tariff would slap European exporters with an additional $116 billion in costs. However, if the Federal Reserve intervenes with a softer dollar policy, that impact could shrink slightly, possibly to around $95 billion. On the flip side, U.S. exports to the EU total about $320 billion. A 20% retaliation from Brussels means an added $64 billion tax hit for American exporters. Economists are already marking this down as a net negative for the U.S. Why? Because Europe's export volume is already supported by weak internal demand, keeping volume steady. But in the U.S., a large chunk of industrial production relies on imported components. That means higher costs are likely to ripple through the supply chain, pushing up consumer prices. When rumors started swirling in late June that the U.S. was heading toward another Trump-style trade policy, alarm bells rang in European capitals. Even before the White House made anything official, Brussels released a stern warning. If the tariff wall stays, even at 10%, expect matching tariffs in cars, airplanes, and agriculture. Within minutes, French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire appeared in front of reporters in Paris and declared, "We will not fall into a destructive loop of tit-for-tat escalation, but we do have a comprehensive list ready, from Boeing aircraft to American soybeans." Over in Berlin, Germany's economy minister Robert Habeck, following an emergency briefing from Volkswagen's executive team, warned, "We are treating the potential $110 billion loss in Germany-U.S. exports over the next decade as a serious threat. In response, our first step will be to deepen economic ties with East Asia to make up for falling U.S. market share in machinery, chemicals, and luxury vehicles." While Berlin hinted at diversifying partnerships, pressure mounted from inside as the Federation of German Industries, BDI, issued a public assessment. Every 10% U.S. tariff will translate into an estimated 2.8% contraction in German industrial output. In Rome, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni attempted to cool tempers, distancing herself from the harsh, fried customs wall metaphor used by coalition partner Matteo Salvini. Yet even Meloni acknowledged the looming threat. According to data from the Italian export agency, if all of Trump's proposed tariffs are implemented, Italy's luxury food and beverage exports worth $3 billion will be put at serious risk. Her economic advisor, Giancarlo Giorgetti, summed up Italy's stance bluntly. If the U.S. offers to exclude automobiles from tariffs, we're open to discussing luxury goods like cheese and Prosecco, but only on mutual terms. Sweden's initial reaction appeared subdued, but that calm was short-lived. At a press conference in Stockholm, Foreign Trade Minister Johan Forssell emphasized, "Our high-tech machinery exports to the U.S., worth more than $18 billion, are at stake. The supply chains of companies from Ericsson to Volvo Trucks will face direct disruption." Sweden stands firmly behind the Commission's retaliatory measures. Back in Washington, Wall Street initially treated the universal tariff proposal like another tax cut, welcoming the plan with rising equity indexes. However, the enthusiasm was short-lived. Minutes from the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, revealed concern that the proposed tariffs would cause a surge in inflation, with core consumer prices likely to rise by 1.3 percentage points due to a 10% increase in import costs. As a result, 10-year Treasury yields surged by 14 basis points in a single day. A simulation from the Peterson Institute paints a grim picture under full retaliation scenarios. The U.S. economy could face a one-third hit to real GDP in just the first quarter. With price pressures escalating, the Federal Reserve might be forced to hike policy rates by 25 to 50 basis points. This, in turn, would widen the average mortgage rate by 40 basis points and stretch corporate bond spreads by another 60. Brussels, meanwhile, has prepared its counterstrike. On the EU's target list, Boeing's wide-body aircraft, corn and soybean shipments from Missouri and Ohio, California-grown almonds, Kentucky bourbon, Tennessee-made guitars, and Hollywood's digital services. Back in the 2018 mini-trade war, the EU had similarly focused on symbolic American goods, hitting Republican states in particular. Now, the bloc is escalating the response, calling its updated retaliation plan a no-limits list. Even if the EU cannot reach some of the high-tech and service sectors that comprise 40% of U.S. exports, Brussels is confident that taxes on aviation, agriculture, and alcohol alone will deliver a heavy blow to supply chains stretching from Iowa to Toulouse. The decades-long Airbus-Boeing rivalry now has a fresh battleground. Airbus expects that European tariffs will inflate Boeing's pricing for local customers by 20 to 25%, crippling its delivery timeline. Within the first trading hour, Boeing's shares had already dropped by 4.3%. The Trump camp, for its part, is undeterred. Officials argue the strategy will push multinational firms back to American soil. We'll beat inflation with corporate tax cuts, they say, and fuel growth using tariffs as our economic engine. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve is finding its options increasingly limited when it comes to managing monetary policy in an environment of elevated tariffs and persistent inflation. The Fed must simultaneously counteract inflation by raising interest rates and deal with fiscal pressure from risky tax cuts that widen the budget deficit. In their updated dot plot for Q3 2025, FOMC members have revised the neutral rate projection upward to 3.5 taxa 3.75%. Analysts in Washington note a growing belief that a strong U.S. dollar is becoming an inevitable outcome. Still, any export-related benefits from higher tariffs may be offset by currency exchange losses. The earliest warning signs for the disruption of integrated supply chains are emerging from the auto industry. Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes have begun rerouting parts to U.S. markets through hybrid production lines in Mexico and Alabama. Roughly 28% of the engine and transmission systems assembled by German automakers originate in the European Union. The blanket 10% tariff has pushed the German supply network to a point where costs and profits are breaking even. According to a report from the IFO Institute, if these trade barriers persist, Germany's manufacturing sector could shrink by 2.8%. Trump's attempt to limit competitive export pricing in the EU is expected to backfire, leading to price hikes in U.S. dealerships and weaker consumer demand. This contradicts the traditional goal of taming inflation. Simultaneously, the EU's quiet response revolves around green energy incentives. Brussels is accelerating the development of its own subsidy framework, the EU Industry Subsidy Act and the Net Zero Industry Act, to counter the United States Inflation Reduction Act, of 2022. Should a customs war erupt, the EU is likely to retaliate by revoking import benefits for U.S. green tech, particularly by applying a carbon tax equivalent to American electric vehicles. This could increase the cost of selling a Tesla Model Y in Europe by $4,000 to $5,000. The message from Brussels is clear. Trump's tariffs aren't only a tool to fix trade imbalances, they're also threatening existing transatlantic cooperation in the race for green industry leadership. At the upcoming U.S.-EU trade dialogue scheduled in Washington for late February, there are three potential paths. 1. The U.S. softens its stance, keeping the 10% tariff ceiling but offering exceptions for key allies. 2. The EU locks in a 15% base customs duty and escalates the matter by forming a WTO panel in 2026. 3. A full-scale trade conflict where no party escapes economic harm. French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire warned that a disruption on this scale could boost global inflation by 0.7% to 1%. This would force central banks to hike interest rates even further, potentially triggering a sovereign debt crisis in emerging markets. In the short term, the most immediate pressure is expected to show up in the U.S. Producer Price Index. Based on the Chicago Fed's model on tariff impacts, sectors heavily reliant on imported intermediate goods, especially automotive, home appliances, and electronics, where over 35% of inputs are imported, will face a 4% producer price increase within the first 6 months. This will translate to a 1% to 1.3% increase in consumer prices. Although Trump has pitched a second round of tax cuts aimed at offsetting inflation, without relying on the Fed's high interest rate policies, despite their negative effect on employment, passing such a bill through Congress will be a serious challenge given the existing $1.8 trillion federal deficit. On Wall Street, CFOs are trying to assess which scenario is less damaging: a consistent 10% tariff with moderate EU pushback, or a prolonged cycle of verbal escalations. If the EU proceeds with its full retaliation plan, U.S. aerospace exports could shrink by $15 billion, with Boeing's 2024 aircraft order-to-delivery ratio potentially falling to 0.8. In agriculture, the loss from reduced soybean and corn exports could total $8.5 billion. The energy sector is also vulnerable. European buyers may begin revising their winter LNG contracts, especially as prices surge when U.S. gas is replaced by alternative supplies, potentially from Russia. In summary, Trump's trade agenda risks escalating from a 10-point tariff policy to a 40-point global economic standoff. If the EU's comprehensive retaliation plan goes forward, and China and Mexico align themselves with it, nearly 68% of American imports could face countermeasures. Here's the rough economic fallout. Producer prices up by 2 percentage points, core inflation rising 0.8 points, interest rates increasing by 150 basis points, unemployment ticking up by 0.4 points, and total factor productivity falling by 0.3 points. Brussels has issued a final diplomatic signal. Talks are still possible. But unless the U.S. carves out exemptions for key trade partners, a broad conflict affecting multiple sectors, well beyond steel and aluminum, is unavoidable. As businesses on both sides of the Atlantic scramble to adjust their cost structures, a new wave of global inflation appears to be forming, driven by protectionism and trade tensions. What do you think about all this? We'd love to hear your perspective, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to stay in the loop with our latest videos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update.